Look around you. Every street you walk, every machine that hums, every tower of glass and stone that scrapes the sky, none of it fell from heaven, none of it was born from the minds of kings or the genius of financiers. This world was built by human hands, and yet those same hands are told they own nothing, decide nothing, and deserve only what crumbs are permitted to fall from the tables of power. From the very first breath of your working life, you are taught to see this arrangement as natural, eternal, unquestionable. But I tell you, what is presented as fate is in truth a system designed, enforced, and therefore capable of being dismantled. Capitalism asks you to believe in an illusion. It teaches that wealth creates work, that profit rewards merit, that poverty is personal failure rather than social design. But history, when stripped of its comforting lies, tells another story. It tells of classes locked in struggle, of a minority that owns the means of production and a majority that owns nothing but its labor power. It tells of surplus value extracted not by magic, but by theft legalized, normalized, and hidden behind contracts and wages. The worker produces more than they receive, and that stolen excess accumulates as capital in the hands of those who do not labor. This is the central contradiction of the system you live under. The worker creates the world, yet stands alienated from it. The products of labor confront their creator as an external power owned by another, controlled by another, sold back at a price. The worker becomes a stranger to their own activity, reduced to a mere appendage of the machine, valued only for efficiency, discarded when no longer profitable. Under such conditions, human potential is not liberated but mutilated, and still the ruling class insists. This is freedom. They point to the choice, to sell your labor or starve, the opportunity to compete with your fellow workers, the right to obey or be replaced. They dress exploitation in the language of liberty and discipline misery with morality. The state, the law, the media, and the institutions of culture work together to reinforce this illusion, to convince you that the existing order is not only inevitable but just. Yet history does not move by illusion, it moves by material reality. And the reality is this: society advances through labor, not ownership. Production is collective, social, and interdependent, while appropriation remains private. This contradiction deepens with every factory built, every algorithm deployed, every market expanded. Capitalism, in its endless hunger for profit, creates not harmony but crisis. It concentrates wealth at one pole and misery at the other. It destabilizes lives, commodifies human needs, and reduces social relations to transactions. But within this crisis lies a force the system itself cannot destroy. The working class, bound together by shared conditions of exploitation, holds immense collective power. Capital depends entirely on labor. Without it, not a single wheel turns, not a single profit is made. This is not a moral argument, it is a material fact. When workers recognize this truth, when they cease to see themselves as isolated individuals and begin to act as a class, the foundations of capitalist domination begin to crack. Unity is therefore not a slogan, it is a necessity. Division among workers is the ruling class as greatest weapon. Nationality, race, religion, gender, and culture are used to fracture solidarity and redirect anger away from its true source. But exploitation does not discriminate in its essence. It operates wherever labor is subordinated to profit. To overcome it, workers must recognize their common interest, their shared enemy, and their collective strength. The task before you is not merely to demand reforms within a system built on exploitation, but to question the system itself, to organize, to educate, to struggle not as individuals begging for mercy, but as a class asserting its historical role. The emancipation of the working class cannot be granted from above, it must be conquered from below. No ruling class has ever surrendered power willingly. It must be taken by conscious, organized action. Do not ask whether transformation is possible. Ask instead how long injustice can survive once it is fully understood. The world you see was made by hands you can join. Those hands, united, can build not a society of masters and servants, but one of equals, where production serves human need, not private profit, and where freedom is measured not by market choice, but by the full development of human potential. History is not finished, it is waiting, and it moves forward when those who produce everything decide they will no longer accept nothing. All wealth is created by labor, yet controlled by those who do not labor. And this contradiction lies at the very heart of the capitalist system. Every object that fills the world of commodities, every service that sustains daily life, every structure that defies modern society originates in human effort applied to nature. Raw materials do not transform themselves, machines do not operate by their own will, and value does not emerge spontaneously from money. It is labor that animates matter, that converts potential into reality, that produces use and exchange alike. Yet the moment this labor enters the capitalist process, it is stripped of ownership, separated from its product, and subordinated to those who command capital. The worker enters production possessing nothing but labor power, compelled to sell it in order to survive. This sale is presented as a fair exchange, a contract between equals, but the appearance conceals its true character. The wage does not represent the full value created by labor. It represents only what is necessary to reproduce the worker as capacity to work. The difference between what the worker is paid and what the worker produces becomes surplus value, appropriated by the owner of the means of production. This appropriation is not accidental or immoral within capitalism. It is systematic, legal, and essential to the accumulation of capital. Control over wealth does not flow from contribution but from ownership. Those who own factories, land, infrastructure, and technology command the products of collective labor without participating in it. Their power does not arise from personal effort, but from social relations that grant them exclusive rights over productive resources. Through this ownership, they dictate the conditions of work, the distribution of goods, and the direction of social development. Labor creates wealth, but capital commands it, shaping society according to the imperatives of profit rather than human need. This separation of labor from control produces alienation. The worker does not recognize themselves in the world they build, because that world belongs to another. The product of labor confronts its creator as an external force, a commodity to be purchased, a profit to be extracted, or a tool of domination. The act of labor itself becomes a means to an end rather than a conscious expression of human capacity. Creativity is reduced to repetition, cooperation to competition, and life activity to survival under discipline. As capitalism advances, this contradiction intensifies. Productivity increases, technology expands, and the social character of labor deepens, yet control becomes more concentrated. Wealth accumulates in fewer hands, while workers face insecurity, precarity, and dispossession. Crises erupt not from scarcity but from overproduction. As goods flood markets where those who created them cannot afford to consume them. The system reveals its irrationality. Abundance exists alongside deprivation, capacity alongside waste, potential alongside misery. To maintain this order, ideology plays a crucial role. The ruling class presents wealth as the reward for risk, intelligence, or innovation, obscuring the collective labor that makes all accumulation possible. Poverty is moralized, success individualized, and exploitation rendered invisible. Workers are encouraged to identify with capital, to aspire to ownership rather than question its legitimacy, to compete with one another rather than recognize their shared condition. In this way, control over wealth is reinforced not only through force but through belief. Yet the material reality remains unchanged. Capital cannot exist without labor, but labor can exist without capital. The dependence flows in one direction, though it is concealed by habit and fear. When workers act individually, this power is fragmented and neutralized. When they act collectively, it becomes a force capable of reshaping society. The recognition that labor creates all wealth is not merely an economic insight, It is the foundation of class consciousness. It reveals that exploitation is not natural, that domination is not inevitable, and that the existing order rests on relations that can be transformed. The struggle over wealth is therefore a struggle over control. To reclaim what labor creates requires challenging the structures that concentrate ownership and decision-making in the hands of a few. It requires organization, solidarity, and the refusal to accept a system where producers are excluded from the products and purposes of their own work. As long as wealth remains controlled by those who do not labor, society will continue to reproduce inequality, instability, and alienation through the very activity that sustains it. Capitalism survives by disguising exploitation as freedom and choice, transforming necessity into virtue and coercion into consent. The worker is told they are free because no chain binds their body, because no overseer openly owns them, because they may choose where to sell their labor. Yet this freedom exists only in form, not in substance. To live, the worker must work. To work, the worker must submit to the conditions set by those who own the means of production. Hunger, rent, debt, and survival replace the whip, enforcing obedience through economic pressure rather than visible violence. The wage relation is presented as a voluntary exchange between equal parties, but equality dissolves the moment necessity enters the equation. One side owns factories, land, technology, and capital. The other owns only their capacity to labor. The choice offered to the worker is not between freedom and unfreedom, but between exploitation and deprivation. This constrained choice is celebrated as liberty, while its structural compulsion is carefully hidden. Capitalism does not deny exploitation, it conceals it beneath contracts, laws, and the language of rights. Freedom under capitalism is reduced to market participation. You are free to buy what you can afford, to sell what little you possess, to compete against others placed in the same desperate position. Social life is reorganized around exchange, and human worth is measured by economic value. The worker is free only as long as they remain useful to capital. When profits decline, freedom evaporates into layoffs, automation, and abandonment, revealing that the promised autonomy was conditional from the beginning. Choice functions as ideology. Workers are encouraged to believe that their position in society reflects personal decisions rather than structural forces. Success is framed as individual merit, failure as individual fault. This narrative fractures solidarity by isolating struggle, turning systemic exploitation into private shame. The worker who cannot escape poverty is told they chose poorly, while the system that restricts real options escapes scrutiny. In this way, capitalism converts domination into self-blame. Even resistance is absorbed into the logic of choice. Workers are told they may leave exploitative conditions if they dislike them, as if exploitation were an exception rather than the rule. The freedom to change. Employers masks the continuity of the wage relation itself. One master is replaced by another, one contract by another, while the underlying structure remains intact. Mobility within exploitation is mistaken for liberation from it. The market appears as a neutral arena where free individuals meet, yet it is structured by power long before any exchange occurs. Ownership determines access, opportunity, and security. Those who control capital dictate the rhythm of work, the length of the day, the intensity of labor, and the distribution of rewards. The worker's so-called freedom exists within boundaries drawn by profit, efficiency, and accumulation. Outside these boundaries lies unemployment, exclusion, and social death. Capitalism also disguises exploitation by separating production from its consequences. The worker rarely sees the full chain of value they create or the wealth it generates. Profit appears to arise from investment, management, or innovation, not from labor itself. This fragmentation obscures the source of wealth and reinforces the illusion that capital produces value independently. The collective nature of production is concealed, while appropriation remains private and unquestioned. The state and its institutions reinforce this illusion by protecting property relations while presenting themselves as guardians of freedom. Laws defend contracts but not equality, rights but not power. Political freedom coexists with economic domination, allowing workers to vote while remaining subordinated in the workplace. Democracy is confined to the political sphere, while the economy, where life is materially determined, remains authoritarian and unaccountable. Culture, education, and media further normalize this arrangement. Competition is celebrated as natural, hierarchy as inevitable, accumulation as progress. Workers are trained to adapt, to hustle, to optimize themselves for markets that offer diminishing returns. The demand to be flexible replaces the right to be secure, and insecurity is reframed as opportunity. Through repetition, exploitation becomes invisible, woven into everyday life as common sense. Yet beneath this surface of freedom lies the constant extraction of surplus value. Time, energy, and creativity are drained to sustain a system that presents itself as the embodiment of choice, while systematically limiting real alternatives. The contradiction between lived experience and ideological promise grows sharper as inequality deepens and precarity spreads. The more capitalism speaks of freedom, the more evident its unfreedom becomes, exposing the gap between what is claimed and what is lived. Alienation reduces human beings to tools of profit, not creators of life, severing the essential connection between people and their own activity, their own creations, and one another. Under capitalism, labor is no longer a conscious expression of human potential, but a means of survival imposed by necessity. The worker does not labor to fulfill a purpose they have chosen, but to earn a wage determined by forces beyond their control. In this condition, work ceases to be life activity and becomes an external obligation, something endured rather than lived. The product of labor stands at the center of this alienation. What the worker creates does not belong to them. It is owned by another and confronts its creator as an independent power. The more the worker produces, the more powerful this alien world becomes, and the poorer the worker feels in relation to it. Wealth accumulates in the hands of capital, while the producer experiences deprivation, not only materially but spiritually. The object that embodies their effort becomes a commodity, stripped of personal meaning and transformed into profit for someone else. This estrangement extends to the act of labor itself. Work is fragmented, repetitive, and dictated by efficiency rather than human rhythm. The worker is reduced to a function, performing isolated tasks without relation to the whole. Creativity is suppressed, autonomy denied, and initiative punished unless it serves accumulation. The body is disciplined to the clock, the machine, and the quota, while the mind is trained to obey instructions rather than shape outcomes. Labor becomes something external to the worker's essence, something that belongs to capital during the hours it is performed. Alienation also distorts the worker's relationship to their own humanity. Human beings are distinguished by their capacity for conscious, creative activity, for shaping the world according to shared purpose. Under alienated conditions, this capacity is denied. The worker experiences themselves not as a full human being, but as a resource to be used, valued only insofar as they generate profit. Life outside work is exhausted by work, leaving little energy for development, reflection, or community. The worker survives, but does not flourish. Social relations are similarly transformed. Instead of cooperation grounded in shared creation, individuals encounter one another as competitors in the labor market. Solidarity is undermined by scarcity and fear, as workers are pitted against each other for wages, positions, and security. Relationships become transactional, mediated by money and status rather than mutual recognition. Even success under these conditions reinforces alienation, as advancement often requires deeper submission to the logic of profit and control. Alienation is not confined to the workplace, it permeates society as a whole. Culture, time, and even emotions are commodified. Leisure becomes recovery for work, education becomes training for employability, and identity becomes branding. Human qualities such as care, creativity and curiosity are valued only when they can be monetized. What cannot be sold is dismissed as unproductive, while what generates profit is celebrated regardless of its social cost. This condition is often internalized. Workers come to see alienation as personal failure rather than social structure. Dissatisfaction is treated as an individual problem to be managed through consumption, distraction, or self-improvement. The system encourages adaptation instead of resistance, coping instead of questioning. In this way, alienation reproduces itself not only through external control but through internal acceptance. Yet alienation also contains its own contradiction. By reducing human beings to tools, capitalism reveals the violence it inflicts on human potential. The gap between what people are capable of and what they are allowed to become grows increasingly visible. The desire for meaningful activity, genuine connection, and creative control cannot be permanently extinguished. It re-emerges in moments of collective struggle, when workers recognize themselves in one another and reclaim their shared capacity to shape the world. To overcome alienation is to restore labor to its rightful place as life activity, as a conscious and collective process directed toward human need rather than private profit. It requires the reintegration of the worker with the product, the process, and the purpose of production. As long as human beings are reduced to instruments of accumulation, life itself is diminished, confined to survival in a world built by hands denied the right to truly live. Class unity is the material force capable of breaking capitalist power, because capitalism itself is sustained by the fragmentation of those it exploits. The system depends on workers seeing themselves as isolated individuals rather than as a collective class bound by shared conditions. As long as labor remains divided, capital rules with ease, extracting surplus value from millions who experience exploitation as a personal struggle instead of a social relation. Unity transforms this condition by converting dispersed labor power into a conscious force capable of confronting ownership, authority, and control. Capitalist power does not rest primarily on ideology or coercion, but on organization. Capital is unified through ownership, coordination, and command over production, while workers are scattered across sectors, identities, and borders. This asymmetry allows a small minority to dominate a vast majority. Class unity challenges this imbalance by reorganizing workers according to their real position in production rather than artificial divisions imposed from above. When workers recognize that their interests are fundamentally opposed to those of capital, the logic of competition begins to collapse. The material basis of this unity lies in production itself. Modern labor is collective by necessity. No commodity is produced by a single individual acting alone. It is the outcome of coordinated effort across workplaces, supply chains, and societies. Capital appropriates the results of this cooperation while denying workers control over it. Class unity reclaims this collective character, revealing that cooperation already exists but is subordinated to profit. Once workers consciously organize this cooperation for themselves, capitalist command loses its foundation. Unity also exposes the true dependence of capital on labor. Profits, markets, and accumulation appear powerful, but they are lifeless without human work. Machines do not generate value independently, and money does not multiply itself without labor animating production. When workers withdraw their labor collectively, capital is rendered powerless. This is not a moral claim, but a material reality demonstrated whenever strikes, slowdowns, or mass resistance disrupt production. Unity turns this latent power into an active force. Capitalist ideology works relentlessly to prevent this realization. Workers are divided along lines of nationality, race, gender, religion, and status, encouraged to see one another as rivals rather than allies. These divisions are not accidental, they are functional. They ensure that anger is misdirected horizontally instead of upward, that frustration is internalized or displaced rather than organized. Class unity cuts through these divisions by identifying exploitation as the common condition that shapes all others. This unity is not spontaneous or automatic. It must be built through struggle, education, and organization. Capitalism trains workers to think individually, to solve collective problems privately, and to measure success personally. Class unity requires a conscious break from this logic, replacing individual advancement with collective liberation. It demands institutions, movements, and forms of solidarity capable of sustaining resistance over time rather than dissipating it through momentary outrage. When unity emerges, it alters the balance of power within society. Workers cease to appear as a passive mass and become a political subject with its own interests and direction. Demands shift from accommodation to transformation, from mitigation of harm to abolition of exploitation. The struggle moves beyond wages and conditions toward control over production, distribution, and social priorities. Capital's authority, once taken for granted, is revealed as contingent and fragile. Class unity also reshapes consciousness. Through collective action, workers recognize themselves not as victims but as agents of history. Solidarity replaces fear, shared purpose replaces resignation, and experience replaces illusion. The act of struggling together undermines alienation by reconnecting individuals to their collective power and capacity. In this process, workers begin to see that the world they inhabit is not fixed but produced and therefore changeable. Capitalism can absorb dissent, commodify rebellion, and reform itself to survive, but it cannot coexist with sustained class unity. Its power relies on separation between those who produce and those who decide, between collective labor and private control. When unity challenges this separation, the foundations of the system are shaken. The force that builds society becomes the force that can reorganize it, turning labor from an instrument of domination into a means of liberation. Conscious, organized struggle is the path to revolutionary transformation, because no system rooted in exploitation has ever been overturned by accident, spontaneity alone, or isolated acts of resistance. Capitalism is not merely an economic arrangement, but a total social order reinforced by institutions, laws, habits, and beliefs that reproduce its power daily. To confront such a system requires more than anger or awareness. It requires clarity of purpose, collective direction, and sustained action grounded in an understanding of material conditions. Consciousness is the first break with domination. It emerges when individuals cease to interpret their suffering as personal misfortune and begin to recognize it as a shared condition produced by social relations. This shift transforms resignation into insight. Workers come to see that insecurity, exhaustion, and deprivation are not failures of character but outcomes of a system that prioritizes profit over life. Consciousness strips ideology of its disguises and reveals exploitation as structural rather than accidental. Yet consciousness alone is insufficient. Capitalism can tolerate awareness as long as it remains fragmented, private, and politically inactive. Without organization, consciousness dissipates into frustration, cynicism, or symbolic protest. Organized struggle gives consciousness form and durability. It binds individuals together into collective bodies capable of acting with intention and continuity. Through organization, workers pool resources, share knowledge, and coordinate action, transforming scattered resistance into material force. Organization also creates discipline, not the discipline imposed by capital, but one generated through collective commitment. Revolutionary struggle requires patience, planning, and endurance. It involves setbacks, repression, and internal conflict. Without organization, movements exhaust themselves in moments of intensity and collapse under pressure. With organization, they learn, adapt, and persist, developing the capacity to confront power over time rather than in brief eruptions. Struggle is the process through which both consciousness and organization are forged. It is not merely a response to oppression, but a school of transformation. Through struggle, workers test their strength against capital, discovering both their vulnerabilities and their power. Each confrontation reveals the limits of reform, the nature of the enemy, and the necessity of deeper change. Struggle exposes the reality that rights are not granted by benevolence but won through conflict. Revolutionary transformation demands that struggle be directed, not only reactive. Conscious organization allows movements to move beyond defensive demands toward offensive goals. It shifts focus from alleviating symptoms to dismantling causes, from negotiating exploitation to abolishing it. This direction is essential because capitalism constantly seeks to redirect struggle into manageable channels, offering concessions that preserve its foundations while appearing to change. The ruling class understands the danger of organized struggle and works relentlessly to prevent it. Legal restrictions, surveillance, repression, and co-optation are deployed to weaken collective action. Ideology encourages patience, moderation, and trust in institutions designed to maintain the existing order. Against these forces, organization provides protection and continuity, ensuring that struggle does not depend on individual courage alone but on collective strength. Conscious struggle also reshapes the subjectivity of those involved. Workers cease to see themselves as powerless recipients of decisions made elsewhere and begin to experience themselves as agents capable of shaping history. This transformation is not abstract. It is lived through action. Solidarity replaces isolation, confidence replaces fear, and shared purpose replaces despair. In this process, the revolutionary subject is formed not through theory alone, but through practice. Revolutionary transformation is not a single event, but a process that unfolds through escalating levels of organization and struggle. Each advance raises new questions, exposes new contradictions, and demands higher forms of coordination. Conscious struggle ensures that this process does not lose direction or dissolve into chaos. It anchors transformation in the material interests of the working class rather than in illusion or improvisation. Capitalism presents itself as permanent, adaptable, and inevitable, but its power rests on relations that can be disrupted and replaced. Conscious, organized struggle targets these relations directly, challenging private control over collective labor and subordinating profit to human need. Through this struggle, the working class does not merely resist the world as it is, but begins to construct the conditions of a different society through its own collective action. The world you inhabit did not arise by chance, nor is it sustained by the will of those who claim to rule it. It is produced daily by labor, disciplined by exploitation, and held together by the illusion that this order is natural and unchangeable. But history teaches otherwise. Every system that appeared eternal was undone when those who carried it on their backs recognized their own power. Capitalism is no exception. Its strength is real, but it is not absolute. It rests on obedience, division, and silence, and each of these can be broken. The task before the working class is therefore clear: to see through the disguises of freedom that conceal domination, to reject alienation as destiny, to recognize unity not as sentiment, but as material necessity, and to transform consciousness into organization, organization into struggle, and struggle into a force capable of remaking society. This is not a call to chaos, but to clarity, not to blind revolt, but to deliberate transformation rooted in the realities of production and power. The hands that built this world have been taught to doubt themselves, to compete rather than cooperate, to endure rather than act. Yet those same hands, united and directed by collective will, possess the capacity to reshape social life itself. When workers cease to accept a world where they create everything and control nothing, history moves. When they organize not for crumbs but for control, the foundations of exploitation begin to collapse. The future is not written by capital, nor guaranteed by progress. It is forged through struggle by those who refuse to remain objects of history and insist on becoming its authors. The world, you see, was made by hands you can join, and once those hands move together with purpose and resolve, they will no longer ask for a place in history, they will seize it.